She can fake it for the photo ops, but we know that Kamala Harris wholeheartedly supports the chaos at our border, the chaos in our streets, and the chaos in the families who have been victims of her open border policies. Border Czar Harris outlandishly compared ICE to KKK and radically called for the ICE to be abolished. She also posted the Minnesota Freedom Fund to bail out violent Black Lives Matter terrorists who burned down cities, looted stores, destroyed communities, and caused over $2 billion in damage to American communities all over America. Kamala Harris is not only the border czar, she is also the czar of chaos. And her policies have destroyed American.
You can always tell when we're getting closer to an election because these extreme members of the Republican Party, they literally turn up the volume on their xenophobia. And they're doing it again with HR 1371. They lie about immigration and public safety. I mean, when you look at studies, it shows that immigration is actually associated with lower crime rates. They fearmonger, they dehumanize, while they're also quoting scripture, which is kind of hypocritical. And they scapegoat asylum seekers, people who, just like my parents, want to seek a life of dignity and hope and have faithfully contributed to their community and to our collective economy. Folks, as you heard from my colleagues here, we are committed because it's important to remember that this week, extreme Republicans are attempting to hold the government hostage so they can advance a bill that creates barriers to voting for U.S. citizens. Bottom line, it is already illegal under current law for non-citizens to register to vote or to vote in federal elections. And despite numerous recounts, challenges in court, and the deep dives by conservative think tanks, there has been zero evidence of widespread voter fraud. Folks, it's a scare tactic. And extreme Republicans are trying to scare Americans, the fear-mongering, into giving up the right to exercise their vote in an accessible and unburdensome election process. The SAVE Act is voter suppression, plain and simple, requiring citizens to show documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, places an extreme burden on countless Americans, including military voters, Native voters, people who have changed their names, including tens of million American women, the elderly, the young, the poor, and naturalized citizens. The SAVE Act's burdens on rightful voters are extreme because most Americans would be unable to register to vote using their driver's license or other state-provided identification alone. Even real IDs do not meet the SAVE Act's requirement. Millions of Americans, including tens of thousands in each congressional district, would be prevented from registering to vote easily, if at all. Americans would not be able to use military IDs or tribal IDs alone when registering to vote. I mean, U.S. citizens who are putting their life on the line would have to go get a passport and other documents to prove their citizenship. People who have changed their names, including millions of married women who would not be allowed to use their birth certificates when proving their citizenship. Registration applications would need to be presented in person, essentially ending mail-in voting and creating barriers for same-day voter registration. The SAVE Act makes it clear exactly who extreme Republicans believe should have an easy time accessing the right to vote, and more importantly, who they believe should have a difficult time.
Over the last few months, my Republican colleagues, you could tell when it happened, have transitioned from using Secretary Mayorkas as a scapegoat for a global migration crisis to now Vice President Harris, who they have wrongfully labeled the border czar. They claim that they want today's hearing to be about policies, so I want to spend time talking about policies, certainly not charts, because we get the dates and the charts wrong here. At the taxpayer's expense, Republicans want to use mass deportation to rip families apart. They want to unconstitutionally strip citizenship from U.S. citizens who have immigrant parents, and they want to expand this border wall that has already cost about $45 million per mile. And folks, we've been talking about this in the last almost 2 hours here. None of this will fix our outdated immigration system that we haven't fixed since 1986 when I was 3 years old, or increase our ability to stop fentanyl trafficking, stem the unlawful flow of weapons across our border, and certainly it won't dismantle these cartels that we should be dismantling. Talking about immigration specifically, we have more than 30 years of data on enforcement-only proposals and policies based on deterrence work, and they simply don't work. Even these cruel actions of the former administration, they didn't actually reduce migration or improve order at the border. Instead, they've resulted in chaos and people forced to wait in unsafe places, and women and children going through the worst cases and experiences, much like my own mother experienced when she crossed the border. So folks, we should be talking about creating legal pathways, and I understand that's Committee on Judiciary, and I wish that you and I were working on that. That is actually what we should be doing together, creating legal pathways, but it doesn't seem like that's what we want to do, because vilifying immigrants seems to be the only priority in this committee, and certainly with most of my colleagues on the other side.
Since being appointed as border czar, Kamala Harris has undoubtedly been a complete failure in her job and has destroyed our country by releasing record-setting levels of criminals, murderers, rapists, and terrorists into our communities. And to get an idea what 73,000 people look like, here is the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. This holds 71,000 people. 73,000, and we have no idea how many more, is how many special interest aliens are in the United States, and DHS does not report it. My bill would require DHS to publish on their website each month the number of SIA encounters and countries of origin. The American people deserve to know the number of potential terrorists Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have allowed to come into the United States. After all, the American people are the taxpayers. They pay to fund DHS and everyone that works inside the entire department. They fund the government, and they have the right to know who is coming across their border, if they're terrorists or not, and which countries they come from.
This bill will do nothing to improve national security. In fact, it would be giving bad actors real-time information about enhanced screenings our law enforcement is conducting, and this legislation would actually make our communities less safe. Rep. Green's bill would require CBP to publish sensitive national security information every single month. Essentially, it would be giving bad actors around the world real-time updates, folks, on DHS operations and intelligence reporting. This bill isn't about security. I want to ensure that data in this committee is used accurately and portrayed accurately, and I want to talk about Donald Trump's favorite chart here, which we used yesterday. In this chart, titled Illegal Immigration into the U.S., Biden's world record illegal immigrants, many from prisons and mental institutions, also terrorists, Donald Trump has said this chart saved his life. And yesterday, in our full committee hearing, Republicans, my colleagues here, repeatedly used this chart to allege that the Biden administration has an open border policy. But this life-saving chart says, well, not what Republicans think it says. First of all, I don't know where the Trumpsters and Republicans of the world who like to trot out this chart get the idea that immigration into the United States is a, quote, world record, unquote, because recorded history is full of mass migration due to wars, due to famine, to disease, and opportunity in numbers so high, folks, it wouldn't even fit in this chart. So it's not a world record. Secondly, and it's almost embarrassing that I have to educate and explain to members of Congress and a former president, but when someone says that they're seeking asylum, and they're coming to the United States seeking asylum, that doesn't mean that they're literally coming from a mental institution. Third, as my friend, Congressman Garcia, pointed out yesterday, Republicans and former President Trump, they don't even know when Trump left office. This chart says that he left April 2020. Trump actually left office in January of 2021 when the numbers were rising and higher, actually even higher than during Obama's second term. Fourth, let's just keep going on this chart. The chart itself shows that when Trump came into office, the numbers actually began rising. The dip in numbers where Trump claims he left office is actually April 2020, at the height of the early COVID-19 pandemic, when folks, migration numbers were dropped globally. I know it's hard for you to see because you've been reading this and now you're finally realizing, oh my God, I've been saying lies. Trump was in office for another 9 months, and those numbers actually were climbing. And lastly, this month, the month that they're talking about, is not even the lowest during Trump's time in office or even in recorded history.
Since being appointed by border czar by President Joe Biden, Kamala Harris has undoubtedly been a complete failure in her job and has destroyed our country by releasing a record-setting levels of criminals, rapists, and terrorists into our communities. Despite the attempts of the fake news media to whitewash her appointment as border czar, as Axios correctly reported, and they're now lying and say they never did, she was in fact labeled a border czar by nearly every major news outlet across the country. Border czar Kamala Harris said, "Do not come," yet proudly welcomed 11.5 million illegals from over 160 countries, including over 2 million known gotaways who completely evaded U.S. authorities. She stood by and allowed these people to come in and idly watched our children and women being raped by illegal alien criminals. She's not just allowing them to come. The policies of the administration allow the CBP One app to import over 400,000 illegals into American communities. Under her watch as border czar, this has happened.
As I walked in here, all I heard was what I hear in committee. Constant criminalizing of immigrant communities. And so let me tell you, I rise in strong opposition to House Resolution 1371. What this is, more lies, more representations, and more inaccuracies. When the majority cannot pass bills, what do? They introduce blatantly political resolutions that consistently target powerful women of color. They are willing to vilify and misrepresent the sitting vice president of the United States for her diplomatic work to address the root cause of migration from Central America. If my Republican colleagues actually cared about immigration or border security, they would address the conditions that drive people to the southern border. They would pass spending bills that invest in foreign humanitarian assistance and international development programs, and they would participate in cooperative efforts to realize a world where people can build their life they want back at home. But they've done none of that. Just this week, I didn't see any of my Republican colleagues at my congressional caucus on global migration. Instead, they want us to waste our time on legislative gimmicks and sham resolutions to score cheap political points. Enough. Seriously, enough. We've been here, we've done this, it's deja vu. I am tired.
I yield gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
They continue to shelve their mass deportation BS. And I'm so tired of it. Let's get to solutions. We should be talking about appropriations. We should be talking about how we make sure that things are working for the American people instead of criminalizing people that are helping us boost our economy. So let's vote no on House Resolution 1371, and let's be done with this waste of time. I yield back to the ranking member.
The D.C. City Council has made a very short-sighted decision that I fear could be a harbinger around the country. And that decision, I believe, lessens and cheapens citizenship. We see that in other areas. But the D.C. City Council has moved to allow non-citizens, including illegal aliens and foreign agents, to vote in local D.C. elections. In fact, not only are they allowed to vote, they're being encouraged. You can look at this flyer right here. This was just sent out by Washington, D.C. to encourage people to vote. Yes, there may be 500 who are registered. This is a year old, but there are 50,000, according to Washington, D.C. statistics, that are eligible. I find it inconceivable that the City Council and now other city councils around the United States would intentionally dilute the voting power of their constituents for non-citizens who otherwise might not meet the requirements, might not pay taxes, might not be members of the community that want the same things as those who are citizens, and therefore I believe it is cheapening and lessening citizenship. Let's look beyond the Democrats' call for this bill to be deemed discriminatory or false claims about its intended purpose. I'm asking my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to look ahead, to put citizenship back in its rightful place as the gold standard. Free and fair elections are a prerequisite for a healthy republic. I believe that's what our founders intended, and non-citizen voting, whether it's 1 vote or 1 million votes, dilutes the voting power of the citizen. I believe Congress must act clearly and decisively to bar non-citizens from voting in any election, including in Washington, D.C., and I urge my colleagues to support my resolution. With that, I yield back.
I rise in opposition to H.R. 192. Look, this is another condescending Republican attempt to do 3 really specific things: meddle in local DC elections, disenfranchise Black and brown voters who are fully capable of governing themselves, by the way, and erode the trust of Americans in our federal elections. In the 118th Congress alone, Republicans have introduced 17 bills to overturn DC's election laws. But they've refused to do the one thing that the residents of DC have asked for, and that's equal representation through statehood. In the Republican tradition of undermining elections, they are pushing this bill while the primary elections in DC are underway. Let's be clear, it is all intentional to stoke fear among voters and raise false alarms around the integrity of DC's voting process. H.R. 192 is another sorry Republican effort to continue to carry on this baseless MAGA narrative about non-citizens affecting the outcomes of federal elections. Let's put this into context. A 2016 study of our federal elections found only 0.001% of votes cast were cases of suspected, not proven non-citizen voting. Even the former president's appointed commission to investigate his claims of voter fraud by non-citizens was disbanded without identifying one single case. In the meantime, 1/3 of working-age Americans are living through crushing medical debt. Families are spending up to 75% of their income in rent and utilities, and scientists agree that the climate crisis may cause 14.5 million deaths by 2050. Yet here we are again. We need to stop entertaining legislation based on Republican lies. There are real problems that need to be addressed and comprehensive solutions. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman and ranking members. You know, I'm not surprised that my Republican colleagues here, including one who has so candidly and callously posted racist tweets about Haitian immigrants, are calling up yet another witness with no credibility on the hearing topic, who believe in conspiracy theories, write about it, and promote lies, alt-right extremist ideologies, to be here. On your X account, Mr. Corral, formerly Twitter, you asked, what is treason? Well, let me answer for you. This right here, this is treason. In one of your tweets, you claim violent January 6 rioters who destroyed public property and attempted to stop a democratic transition of power as political prisoners. I find it to be shameful that a former law enforcement agent would defend a mob who beat law enforcement officers protecting this very building. In another post, you write, mass deportations will be swift, but they will be deadly. Actually, I agree with you on that. They will be deadly. So I find it unforgivable that you, Trump, and Republican members of this committee would even advocate for it. In another post, you say we should destroy the federal government and that the federal government is the enemy. I find that odd considering you were once a federal employee and you've been begging to come back into the incoming Trump administration for a new job. Lastly, you posted that the federal government is the epicenter of pedophilia. an outright falsehood with perhaps the exception of Trump's stellar attorney general pick. I have no questions for you. No one serious about our role here should be asking you questions. Your misleading statements are counterproductive, and this committee tomorrow is supposed to be having, although I'm hearing we may not have, a committee hearing on worldwide threats. To me and so many others, the fear-mongering, the racist invasion rhetoric that you and extremist Republicans spread, in my opinion, is probably the truest threat to our homeland. So, Ms. Laren, I want to ask you a question. And first, let me start by saying more than 4,000 children were forcibly separated from their parents under Trump's family separation policy, including infants who were literally removed from their mother's arms. Because of that administration's cruelty and incompetence, more than 1,400 of these children still have not been reunited with their parents, more than 6 years later. They may never be reunited with their parents. Trump has said that he will do it again. He will deport and separate families. Ms. Laren, can you tell us why it's been so difficult to reunite children separated under President Trump?
You know, there are several reasons. First, there was no planning before the separation policy was put in place. So DHS and ORR didn't have an opportunity to put procedures in place to track the children. There was no database that both agencies could access and share to track the whereabouts of the children. And in HHS's database, ORR's database, there was no field to indicate even whether the child had been separated from a parent. So it became a very labor-intensive paper process to reunite children with their family members that has taken many years and, as you say, is ongoing.
Do you think that particularly the babies, the toddlers, the one-year-olds who are ripped away from their families will ever be reunited?
They were particularly difficult to reunite because they could not advocate for themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Look, folks, you have the trifecta. You'll have an opportunity to pass solutions. We want to address the issues, and look, I'm the first to tell you, I don't want to hear about one woman being raped crossing that border. My mother experienced it while pregnant with me, crossing that border. So let me tell you something. If you decide that you are going to be the party that's going to bring solutions and create the legal pathway so no child is kidnapped, raped, or no woman is, then I look forward to working with you on that. But if all we're going to continue to do in this committee is bring people here who continue to dehumanize children and families who are risking everything because they have lost everything crossing that border, then I'm going to continue to push back and fight back because I actually understand what's happening in these countries. I have visited these countries. I want to get to the root cause of migration. I want to get to solutions. You've been talking about policy solutions. You're going to have the opportunity to do it.
The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The root cause of migration is a federal government that has legalized an invasion into this country. That's the root cause. And you talk about treason, I can tell you right now, I consider that treason against American citizens. This has been an invasion in this country, and the cartels have benefited by tens of billions of dollars. Mass deportations cannot happen fast enough. Not fast enough. Not for the cartels, terrorists, gangs, and criminals that have made billions and billions of dollars, and children have been the biggest victims of it. Border Czar Kamala Harris said, "Do not come," yet proudly welcomed over 12 million illegals from over 170 nations and territories, including over 2 million known gotaways who completely evaded U.S. authorities. Included in this 12 million are special interest aliens, also known as SIAs. Special interest aliens are individuals who pose a potential national security risk to the United States, typically from a nation that promotes terrorist activity or harbors terrorists. Under the Biden-Harris administration, there have been at least 73,000 special interest aliens arrested at our border. This does not include the potential SIAs among the 2 million known gotaways who weren't arrested and are now roaming American communities. I say at least 73,000 because the truth is that we do not know the current number since DHS does not publicly release it anywhere. In fact, the only reason we even have this number is because it was leaked to the press. Shocking that that's the only way Americans know. I'd like to remind everyone, it only took 19 terrorists to kill close to 3,000 Americans on 9/11 and wound more than 6,000 Americans. The American people deserve to know how many and from which countries these potential terrorists are coming from, which is exactly what my bill will do. According to the former chief Border Patrol agent for the San Diego sector prior to the Biden-Harris administration, the sector averaged only 10 to 15 SIA arrests per year. He testified, once word was out that the border was far easier to cross, San Diego went to over 100 SIAs in 2022, well over that in 2023, and even more than that this year. The number of special interest aliens has skyrocketed, and even more egregiously, this administration has tried to cover it up. The administration of Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Secretary Mayorkas told the chief Border Patrol agent that he was prohibited from releasing any of this information on the increase in SIAs or mention any of the arrests. Prohibited. The administration was trying to convince the public that there was no threat at the border. They are complicit in covering up the complete invasion at our border.
Recognize the gentlelady from the great state of Illinois.
Thank you. It is a great state indeed. Thank you, Chairman. Look, this bill is another plea to stoke fear and push all the anti-immigrant rhetoric right before the election. Last week at a full committee hearing, Republicans actually argued that Democrats were being misleading on border issues while trying to use some chart that had mistakes left and right, misinformation everywhere. I guess they believe that facts and statistics, let me say it again, are misleading. This is all to shield from the fact that this do-nothing Congress under Republican leadership has been the least effective, folks, since the Civil War. Is it any surprise that today, the last day we're in session, before the November election, that Republicans are bringing 20 bills to markup? Folks, there's no coincidence. Up until today, we've considered very, very little legislation, trust me. No one is fooled by today's actions. And it's been painfully misleading to listen to my Republican colleagues bash immigrants at every single opportunity they get. They've called them terrorists, criminals, freeloaders, other things that I won't mention that my colleagues here call them. They've spread dangerous lies around racist narratives about migrants that have affected our communities and our constituents. But folks, it's also misleading that Republicans have blamed the administration at every turn for an increase in fentanyl and a crisis at our southern border. And then up until really today, they've pretty much blocked any attempts to seriously legislate. Republicans can say that they're taking action to help people. But folks, the American people clearly see the inaction of this Congress. You can't get the votes. We're leaving today on a CR because you can't get your votes. I believe we should be taking up measures in this committee that actually help our communities. Measures like HR 1643, the New Deal for New Americans Act, which helps immigrants and refugees thrive, integrate safely, and contribute to our community. There are so many bills that we should be working on, but what we're doing here is actually helping terrorists get information to make our country less safe in homeland security. So this bill, all it does, folks, let me make sure that you hear this. All that this bill does, that the gentle lady from Georgia has introduced, is tip off terrorists, by providing them the information to help skirt out security measures. And while doing that, she of course has to make sure that we stoke fears about immigrants in the process. This is a horrible, scary bill, folks. I oppose it, and I encourage the rest of us, if for no other reason, for the security of this country, to also oppose it. I yield back. Sheriff Hathaway, I want to hear from you in the next minute or so. What should Congress be focusing on to secure the border and support border communities like yours?
Well, specifically, there is a dividing line between federal and state law enforcement. The federal agencies in my town, federal officers, outnumber 30 to 1. There's 30 federal officers for every one local officer. So that includes one of the largest Border Patrol stations in the U.S. and the third largest that are both in my county. Large contingents of CBP, OFO, those are the guys in the blue uniforms on the border that do the inspections at the ports of entry. And, frankly, I don't want to do their job, and they don't want to do my job. I do the same job as the 3,000 other sheriffs in the U.S. There's about 3,000 counties and 3,000 elected sheriffs in the U.S. I treat everybody the same. Our focus is violent crime and property crime. So, as far as it's up to you what you decide on the federal issues that have to do with the border, but to me, I don't see a bigger impact of, crime or property damage with anything to do related to the border. So financially, I don't need no more support. I don't need more legal support. But I do think Congress needs to solve the issues on the border to create legal pathways for workers.
So, Sheriff, you think that this Congress should be focused on creating legal pathways, yes or no?
That's correct.
And you think that this Congress should do the thing it hasn't done in almost 40 years, which is actually fix the immigration system. Is that yes?
Fix immigration, look at the Farm Modernization Act, and consider getting these agricultural visas in place.
Got it. Well, I agree with those two things here, and I think that vilifying immigrants is really dangerous, and it actually reveals to me that we have a short memory here. In the 18 and early 1900s, Italians, Irish, Germans, and others from parts of Europe who are the ancestors of many of the people in this room, whom you carry their last name now with pride, were treated as less than human. And if our country today were to suddenly face increased migration from that region, I would be with you protecting them like hell. So it's really hard for me to watch the very same grandchildren of these people who were harmed, who were neglected, who were abandoned and starved, doing the same thing to others that were done to their grandparents. Which is why every single chance that I'm in this committee, I'm going to remind you of your roots, and I'm going to remind you that our job is to create the kind of policy so that we create legal pathways so that people that come to this country from Europe or from Latin America are able to come here, yes, the legal way, without experiencing the things they do at the border. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses that are here today. I also want to recognize that just last week, we recognized the anniversary of the heinous 9/11 terrorist attacks that took the lives of 2,977 people. Future stolen for 2,977 individuals. And actually, Congress created this committee, Homeland Security, to ensure that we'd protect the American people from terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues choose to use our committee time to spew false narratives, conspiracy theories, and racist tropes that point as immigrants as terrorists. Immigrants, like my mother and my husband, as terrorists, just to score cheap political points. So, look, we should be using this committee to actually discuss how we strengthen the federal government's ability to prevent and respond to terrorist threats by digging into the data and digging into the evidence. Folks, facts matter. We have to stop with the disinformation. But I guess when it comes to making charts for the former president, that doesn't apply. And I'm going to tell you, this committee is a serious committee. We have to use facts. So I want to use the last minute here. I want to come back to Mr. Norasta. Can you help us understand, because actually I think some of my colleagues don't understand, why are people coming to the United States and risking their lives the way that they are? And how does that help us economically?
The primary reason why immigrants come to the U.S. historically and today, legally and illegally, is because of job and labor market opportunities. If you want to do a regression analysis, you can see very closely that the job openings in the U.S. is closely correlated with the number of illegal immigrant apprehensions along the border and with people trying to come here legally. The best pull to come to the U.S. has always been the economy. It is still the economy. That is what's pulling people in. And the rapid economic recovery after COVID can explain more than any other factor, although some of the other ones do matter, can explain more than any other change in policy why there is such a rapid and large increase in illegal immigration.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield back.
I grew up in Humboldt Park in the city of Chicago. And I saw my immigrant parents work really long hours, the minimum wage jobs. My dad worked 2 jobs, my mom worked 2 jobs, and somehow she also managed to give a lot of time to her local church. What they couldn't afford was childcare. My dad worked my mother worked first shift, so my dad can work third shift, and they can figure out how to make sure that their kids always had someone at home. And that meant that my parents could barely ever see each other. My parents' experience is not very different from the reality of so many others right now. And look, I witnessed the struggles of my community to secure stable housing, to ensure quality education for their children, and to raise a family with a rising cost of living. But let me be very clear. Working people are still struggling. The cost of living in America, well, let's just say, we say it, right? It's too damn high. Too often I hear my constituents, my neighbors talk about having to make a decision. Can I go to the grocery store and buy the eggs and buy the milk, try to get some spinach, try to get the bread, pay the $2,200 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago, and then afford my inhaler? And Congressman, oftentimes what ends up happening is that people have to choose between being able to feed their children and their health care. Feeding their children and an inhaler. In one of the most richest countries in the whole world. Why is it so hard for us to move a working people's agenda in Congress? Like, you would think there's more of us that come from working class than ever before. Some of us actually understand what it's like to have to help our parents who are probably making $100 too much for Medicaid, so they need help covering their health care. Like, there are more of us here who are working class. But somehow, a working people's agenda in this place doesn't seem to be a priority. We ask ourselves, why doesn't the American people trust that we're working for them? Well, let me answer that question. When unchecked corporate power and greed in the marketplace meet unchecked corporate money in politics, well, we have a problem. And it's families in Illinois 3, 4, 5, your own district, who end up suffering because of it. We know that price gouging, price fixing, predatory algorithms, and corporate monopolies put profits and production over people. And it's why I joined my colleagues in sending a letter that Congresswoman Jayapal was just talking about around opposing the Kroger-Albertson merger. Because we have to resist the consolidation of corporate power if we're going to protect working people. I'm also a proud co-sponsor of Congresswoman Omar's Shrinkflation Reduction Act, which would enhance price transparency for consumers and combat the deceptive practice of shrinkflation. Look, I go to my local grocery store, and I can literally see the difference between what people in my community are paying and what someone else in a community that has 4 grocery stores pays. They usually pay 25% more. We need the kind of accountability that bills like this will bring. Shrinkflation practices hide behind the language of inflation, but we know that actually consumer exploitation is intended to defraud us, that corporations can continue to profit while providing less product. And listen, we know how corporations are able to get away with these practices. It's because they use their profits to buy the same exact people who are responsible for holding them accountable. Yeah, I said it. Big money in politics, whether poured into elections or directly in the pockets of corrupt public servants, gives special interests in corporations outsized influence in our democracy. So when a good bill comes before us, when a good bill comes to the committee, somehow we can't actually debate the bill. Because it's a good bill, It should pass. But these corporations have the power to buy elections and buy elected officials. And look, our democracy is weaker and our communities suffer when the voices of working families are buried under the influence that millions can buy. We see it too often. It's why we need bills like HR 1118, the Disclose Act, to end the scourge of dark money buying our democracy. And it's why I'm a proud co-sponsor of the act that Rep. Pappas has introduced, because it does a couple things. It requires super PACs and dark money groups to disclose donors who've given $10,000 or more during an election cycle. It requires those spending money on ads to disclose their donors. And it cracks down on the use of shell corporations to hide the identity of a donor. If you are donating to an elected official or candidate, the public should know who you are. And the Disclose Act bill does just that. Because look, if our democracy is not for sale, which it shouldn't be for sale, then mega donors should not be attempting to buy our democracy. And it means we have to bring the full power of the federal government through regulation, through accountability, and through transparency to fight for working people, for our constituents. And it's also why I think it's so important that we're co-sponsoring legislation like Congresswoman Jayapal's bill, which is the Stop Corporate Capture Act, HR 1507. It institutes reforms to right-size the influence of corporate interests over a regulatory process. It increases transparency of government rulemaking decisions, and it establishes a mechanism for the public to hold agencies accountable. We have to do everything possible so that the American people trust that those of us that are in the people's house are actually here for them. Because the reality is that they don't. They do see us as people who are here to enrich ourselves. People are here to hear ourselves speak. Working families demand accountability, and they have given us a mandate. They're asking us for bold solutions to economic justice, and it means taking on corporate greed. As we get closer to an administration that has promised to weaken the pillars of our democracy more than ever, I think it's going to be critical that progressives, but every Democrat, frankly, every elected official that's here for working families, get together to unite and address corporate greed. Because if we don't, we'll continue to see what we see now. Corporations becoming wealthier than wealthy can possibly be, while poor people continue to have to choose between healthcare and feeding their children. Congressman DeLuzio, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you for bringing up such an important, critical issue that I look forward to working with you in the next Congress. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I thank the gentlelady from Illinois for her powerful words. This democracy is not for sale, and that should not be something that's controversial in this chamber or anywhere else. Our constituents expect us to fight for all of them. One of the places that we've seen this consolidation, this concentration, this raw power really hurt folks, agriculture. We see it because we know that food production is a key step in that grocery supply chain that we know we hear from our constituents about costs being too high. We're all paying more, too much for food because of this consolidation that we see in agriculture. Folks are getting ripped off. They're tired of it.
Folks, we are at a crossroads right now. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus is committed to strengthening voting rights. Because we know, and our caucus wants to make sure that we protect the right to vote by passing broad and comprehensive voting rights bills that eliminates barriers to voting for U.S. citizens. We want same-day automatic and online voter registration. We're committed to improving representation because we're the party that wants to abolish the Electoral College, grant statehood to the District of Columbia, and establish a democratic process for the people of Puerto Rico to determine the island's future political status. We are committed to bold campaign finance reform. We are the party that wants to end corruption and get big money and corporations out of politics by finally eliminating dark money in elections. We are committed to fully funding federal agencies that invest in Americans' health, education, and well-being. And we are the party that wants to ensure that Congress funds vital federal agencies and prevents the privatization of government services. We are committed to reforming the filibuster. And we are the party that wants to allow for the democratic consideration and passage of essential legislation. We are committed to ethics reform. We are the caucus that wants to ban stock trading and ownership for members of Congress and the federal judiciary and impose an enforceable code of conduct on the Supreme Court, including instituting accountability measures and restrictions on gifts and requiring judicial disclosures and recusal. We are committed to reforming the court. We are the party that wants to expand the number of justices on the bench, implement term limits, and create new judgeships across the federal system. It is in this moment, in this context, that my colleagues and I come to this chamber to convene the special order hour, to make it crystal clear exactly who is committed to doing the work of repairing and strengthening democracy. And repairing and strengthening and protecting our democracy is one of my greatest priorities in Congress. You see, I have the honor of co-chairing the House Task Force on Strengthening Democracy, where I meet with my colleagues to discuss legislative solutions to act on Americans' desire to fortify the basic building blocks of healthy democracy. And during the August recess, I launched my democracy working groups in Chicago and DuPage County. I convene constituents and grassroots leaders and organizations to share what they have seen, what they've learned, and what they have felt as they do the work on the ground of building a democracy that works for everyone. I hosted a teletown hall focused on making government work for Illinois 3, and a Wheaton town hall focused on the topic of defending democracy. You see, listening to the voices of our communities and ensuring those voices are heard and valued is part of our democracy and is what's most important. What we've learned and affirmed is that democracy is a work in progress. It's not perfect by any means. We have heard that we cannot simply strengthen democracy, simply preserve democracy. We must repair it and expand it where it's not living up to its potential. We need democracy that truly works for the people, where government is responsive to the needs of its citizens, where we keep big money out of politics, ethics reform both in our Supreme Court and presidency, protecting our election workers and our right to vote, defending public institutions from privatization and elimination. And that's why I'm so proud to co-sponsor numerous substantial pieces of legislation across the broad aspects of democracy and good governance, including bills like the Freedom to Vote Act by Congressman Sarbanes and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act by Congressman Sewell, which must be among the first bills we take on in the 119th Congress. And as I wrap up in a few minutes our special order hour, I do want to talk about some of the movers and shakers that are helping do this work, repair, strengthen, and protect our democracy. And to do so, I want to start by recognizing an organization that serves the state of Illinois, led by one of my constituents, Mary Ellen Daniels. And she's improving access to information, amplifying the voices of young people, and breaking down barriers to their participation. Illinois Democracy Schools Network is a vital initiative committed to educating the next generation about the civic process. The growing network of middle and high schools is dedicated to expanding civic learning opportunities across Illinois, particularly in schools serving students of color, to ensure all students are prepared to meaningfully participate in public life. By creating high-quality learning experiences, the Democracy Schools Network helps foster, inform, activate, and provide equitable civic engagement among young people. On behalf of Illinois 3rd Congressional District, I do want to thank the Illinois Democracy Schools Network for nurturing the foundations of our democracy. And folks, free and fair elections are the cornerstone of our democracy. And it's why I co-sponsored and co-sponsoring several pieces of legislation that protects and expands ballot access, as we just talked about. But I do want to go into HR 11 a little deeper. Expanding voter registration and voting access prohibits voting roll removal, establishes Election Day as a federal holiday, and enacts other voting rights and election reforms. HR 14, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, strengthens voting rights by expanding and strengthening government's ability to respond to voting discrimination. Defending the right to vote is defending our communities. Let me say that again. Defending the right to vote is defending our communities. And so I will continue resisting and challenging any attempt from extremists in our government to undermine our democracy and erode our rights. We all have a role to play to get engaged, to register people to vote, to serve as election judges, to combat misinformation, and we have to fight for the democracy that we deserve. And there's an organization that's been doing this work around the clock, defending democracy, and that is Midwest Voting Rights Program of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. This vital initiative focuses on ensuring fair access to the vote and upholding election laws. Through their election protection program and litigation, they provide critical resources on Election Day. They partner with incarcerated and returning community members to expand voting rights. They ensure racial equity in redistricting, and they defend civil rights and advocate for equitable election laws in Illinois and Indiana. A notable leader in this work is Clifford Helm, Senior Counsel for the program and a proud constituent of Illinois' 3rd Congressional District. Thank you, Clifford and Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, for your dedication to eliminating barriers to voting and enhancing civic participation, especially in marginalized communities. We also need organizations that create and provide citizen tools to hold our officials accountable. And that's why I'm proud to recognize Indivisible, a grassroots movement dedicated to strengthening our democracy through education and civic engagement. Through Indivisible Civics, they provide invaluable resources, training, and tools to empower local groups and activists, including to engage with their local elected officials and hold them accountable. Since the beginning of 2019, Indivisible members have made 73,625 calls to Congress and have organized over 2,000 grassroots events in all 50 states. And their focus is civic knowledge and skills that help individuals become effective advocates and informed citizens. In Illinois' 3rd Congressional District, active Indivisible chapters in Illinois and civic leaders like Diane McGuire, Deborah McCoy, Kathy Tholen, Jerry Can, Patricia Graham, Denise Polak, they're working tirelessly to engage their neighbors in the civic process. And I want to thank Invisible for their commitment to fostering a well-informed electorate and a stronger democracy. And folks, while extreme Republicans demonstrate which Americans they believe should have access to vote and who they believe shouldn't, I am honored to recognize the nonprofit Chicago Votes for their efforts in fostering civic engagement among the next generation of leaders in our city. Their Unlock Civics program works to increase democratic participation from justice-impacted adults, from registering over 5,000 voters in Cook County Jail to advocating for legislation to make the jail the first in the nation to serve as a primary election voting location. Chicago Votes also works to engage young people in local civic processes, from the regular parade to the polls, to creating nonpartisan voting guides, to supporting educators around civic curriculum. Their fellowship and their leadership development opportunities for youth and justice-impacted individuals, including their Democracy Corps, build stronger leaders for a stronger, more informed democracy. So Chicago Votes, thank you. I also want to acknowledge the work of organizations like the Latino Policy Forum. Latino Policy Forum is doing the work to protect our multicultural, our multiracial democracy from attempts to scapegoat, silence, criminalize, and persecute our Latino and our immigrant communities. Through their efforts and coalition, the forum has engaged comunidades Latinas in the civic process of our democracy. whether by expanding participation or access to multilingual and culturally competent educational voter material. The organization is fighting to ensure equitable representation and fair investment in our communities. The work has been possible thanks to the efforts of its staff and its president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum, Silvia Puente, who after 16 years of service announced her well-earned retirement. Her unwavering leadership has been instrumental in driving positive, meaningful change for our communities. And in the face of the cruel policies that are looking to hurt our communities, thank you for inspiring us with your leadership. Gracias por luchar por nuestra comunidad contra viento y marea. And so, as I wrap up here, I want to thank all my colleagues who joined tonight's Progressive Caucus Special Order Hour. And I want to end with this. I am the product of community organizing. I am the product of a movement that continues to fight for what is right, even when the attacks just keep coming, and even in the face of fear, even in the face of loss and hardship. We are and have been a nation at a crossroads. We say we are facing an existential crisis, but the truth is that we've been facing this crisis for a very long time. This country has consistently faced a crossroad: to choose fear or to choose hope, to choose love or to choose hate, to choose bigotry or to choose equity, to choose oppression or to choose justice. We face those all too familiar crossroads again. Will we choose democracy or will we submit to dictatorship? Democracy is a grand experiment of collective experience, and it cannot be taken for granted. It is precious and fragile, and it requires that we strive to be the best of ourselves. And I am encouraged that each time this country faced a crossroads, organizers were there, bending the arc of history towards justice, fighting like hell. We fight like hell for our communities. Our communities have always been at this target of injustice. But we also know that we fight like hell for our children and their future. We fight like hell against Trump and MAGA Republicans and Project 2025 as they are a fundamental threat to our children. The people want big money out of politics. The people want us to reform the Supreme Court. The people want us to protect the integrity of our elections. And our democracy will be repaired, strengthened, and preserved when we fight for democracy. And so, folks, I believe that the people united will never be defeated because we have something to fight for. And I fight for my husband, a dreamer. I fight for my nieces and nephews. I fight for every Latina who aspires to public office. I fight for the movement. And the fight ahead is worth it. So there is no greater honor to fight alongside you to protect, preserve, and expand democracy. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.